Mira didn't cry when her father told her. That was the part that surprised her most. She thought there would be tears, screaming maybe, something. Instead, she just sat there on the kitchen stool, staring at the crack in the tile floor that had been there since she was 12, and felt nothing at all. 60,000, her father said again, like repeating the number would make it sound smaller. That's what I owe him. 60,000, Mira, and he's not a patient man. So sell the truck. I sold the truck 3 months ago. You didn't notice because you don't ask me anything anymore. That stung a little, but not enough to matter, not next to what he'd just said before that. He wants a wife. That was the actual sentence. Not a payment plan. Not an apology, a wife, and apparently her father had already decided which daughter to offer, because there was only one. Who is he? Mira asked. Not really a question, more like she needed to hear it out loud to believe it was real. Her father wouldn't look at her. Does it matter? It matters to me. Alpha Corbin, he said finally, and something in his voice cracked when he said it, like the name itself cost him something. Alpha Corbin of the Ashcroft Pack. Mira had heard the name before. Everyone had. Not because he was cruel, nobody actually said that, not even the people who hated him, but because nobody knew anything real about him. He didn't attend the summits. He didn't take mates. He'd built the Ashcroft Pack from almost nothing into the wealthiest territory on the Eastern Ridge, and then he'd just disappeared into it. 12 years, maybe more, without a single public appearance. He's a ghost, she said. You're selling me to a ghost. I'm not selling what else would you call it. Her father didn't have an answer for that. He just sat down across from her, put his head in his hands, and for the first time in longer than Mira could remember, looked old. She almost felt sorry for him. Almost she went to her room that night and didn't sleep. She lay on top of the covers, fully dressed, staring at the ceiling fan turning slow, lazy circles above her, running through every version of escape she could think of. She had maybe $400 saved. A car that didn't run half the time. No family beyond her father, no pack of her own to run to, because her mother's people had cut ties years before Mira was even born, over some feud nobody ever explained properly. There was nowhere to go. That was the truth she kept circling back to, no matter how many times she tried to talk herself into a different answer. Around 2 a.m, she heard her father moving around downstairs, the clink of a bottle against a glass, the particular silence of a man drinking alone because he couldn't stand his own company sober. She thought about going down, thought about screaming at him, asking him how exactly he'd let it get this bad. How many nights he'd sat in that kitchen making choices that eventually landed on her. She didn't go down. She just lay there instead, and somewhere before dawn, exhaustion finally won out over anger, and she slept. The next 2 days moved strangely too slow and too fast at once. Her father barely spoke to her, orbiting around the house like a man serving out a sentence. And Mira found herself doing small, pointless things to keep her hands busy. She cleaned the kitchen twice. She went through her closet and packed a bag, then unpacked it, then packed it again, unsure what a person was even supposed to bring to whatever this was. On the second night, she caught her father standing outside her door, hand raised like he meant to knock. And then, not knocking. What? She said, not unkindly, just tired. He lowered his hand. I wanted to say I'm sorry. Properly, not the version I gave you before. Okay? That's it? Okay? What do you want me to say? That it's fine? It's not fine. But you're still going to do it, so I don't see what an argument gets either of us. Her father's face did something complicated guilt, maybe. Or something closer to relief that she wasn't screaming at him, which somehow made it worse. He's not a cruel man, from what people say. That's all I could find out. Nobody knows much, but nobody's ever said a bad word against him either. That's supposed to make me feel better? I don't know what would make you feel better, Mira. I wish I did. She almost told him, then almost said the thing that had been sitting in her chest since he first said the number 60,000 out loud. That she didn't hate him for owing money. People made mistakes, got in over their heads. That was just life. What she couldn't forgive, what she wasn't sure she'd ever forgive, was that he'd let it get so bad he ran out of anything else to sell before he ran out of her. She didn't say any of it. She just nodded, and he left. And that was the last real conversation they had before the car came. The car that came for her 3 days later was black, unmarked, expensive in a way that made the whole street go quiet when it pulled up. No crest on the door. No guards standing around it like she expected. Just a driver, an older man with kind eyes and a bad limp, who opened the door for her and said, "Whenever you're ready, miss. No rush." That was the first thing that didn't fit. Everything she'd imagined, and she'd imagined a lot. Lying awake the last 3 nights involved being dragged, or at least herded. Not asked. Not given time. She took one bag. Her father stood on the porch and didn't come down the steps. He said her name once, and she didn't turn around, and that was the last conversation they had before she got in the car. The drive took 4 hours. The driver, whose name was Samuel, talked the whole way about nothing, the weather, a bridge that was under construction, a dog he used to have, and Mira realized after the 2nd hour that he was doing it on purpose. Filling the silence so she wouldn't have to sit in her own head. "You don't have to do that," she said eventually. "Do what, miss?" "Talk, to distract me." Samuel glanced at her in the mirror. "Old habit," he said. The last few who came up this road were pretty quiet the whole way. Figured quiet wasn't doing them any favors. The last few. That was the second thing that didn't fit. She'd assumed she was the first. She didn't ask what happened to the others, because she wasn't sure she wanted to know, and Samuel didn't offer. Somewhere around the 2nd hour, the highway gave way to smaller roads, and the smaller roads gave way to something that barely counted as a road at all, packed dirt, lined with trees so tall they blotted out most of the afternoon light. Mira watched the scenery change and tried to keep her breathing even, tried to remember that panicking wouldn't change anything about where this car was taking her. "Can I ask you something?" she said. "Course, is he going to hurt me?" Samuel's eyes flicked to the mirror again, and this time there was something gentler in them, something almost sad. "No, miss, I've worked for that man 22 years, never once seen him raise a hand to anyone who didn't have it coming, and even then rarely whatever you're picturing. I'd let that picture go if I were you." "That's easy to say." "It is," Samuel agreed. "Doesn't make it less true." They drove past a scattering of farmhouses, a general store with a hand-painted sign, a small white church with its doors propped open even though it was a weekday. Mira hadn't expected any of it to look so ordinary. Some small, stubborn part of her had built the Ashcroft territory into something dark and foreboding in her mind, and every mile of normal countryside chipped away at that image a little more, leaving her strangely unmoored, like she didn't know what to be afraid of anymore. "How long have you worked for him?" she asked, mostly to keep talking. "Started when he was 20, right after his father passed. Rough time for this pack, back then. Rougher than most people know." Samuel's hands tightened slightly on the wheel. He was young to be handed a territory in that kind of trouble. Did all right for himself, though, better than all right. What was his father like? Samuel was quiet for a moment, like he was choosing his words carefully. Hard man, not cruel exactly, but hard. Corbin's not much like him, if that's what you're asking. Wanted to make sure you knew that before you met him. Mira turned that over, filing it away with everything else, the picture forming in her head a young alpha inheriting chaos, building something out of nothing, choosing to be different from a father who'd been hard, didn't match anything she'd braced herself for. The gravel drive appeared without warning, curving off the main road and disappearing into a line of trees. Samuel slowed the car, and Mira felt her stomach tighten all over again. The calm of the drive evaporating the moment the destination became real. "Almost there, miss," Samuel said, not unkindly. "For what it's worth, I think you'll be all right here." She didn't answer. She just watched the trees thin out ahead of them, the first glimpse of brick and ivy coming into view, and braced herself for whatever came next. The Ashcroft estate wasn't what she pictured either. She'd built an image in her head, something cold, something built to intimidate. Black iron gates and stone gargoyles, the whole Gothic package. What she got instead was a long gravel drive lined with actual apple trees, half of them still holding fruit this late in the season, and a house that looked more like it belonged to a retired professor than the most powerful alpha on the ridge. Warm brick, ivy that someone clearly let grow wild on purpose, a porch light already on even though it wasn't dark yet. "He's not home right now," Samuel said, carrying her bag up the steps before she could take it herself. "Got called out this morning. Border thing, nothing serious. He said to tell you to settle in and he'll be back for dinner." He said that. His exact words, miss. Mira didn't know what to do with that. She'd rehearsed things in her head, arguments, a version of herself that would refuse to be afraid. Maybe even a version that would try to run. None of it accounted for a house with apple trees and a man who left instructions to make sure she felt welcome. She hated that it worked. A little. She hated that some small, exhausted part of her felt relief. The woman who met her at the door introduced herself as Greta, the housekeeper, and she had the kind of face that had clearly done a lot of smiling over the years, even if it wasn't smiling now. "You must be tired," Greta said. "Come on. Room's ready. Bath's ready too if you want it." "I don't need you'll want it," Greta said, not unkindly. "Trust me." Mira followed her up a wide staircase, past a hallway of framed photographs she didn't get a good look at, into a room that was bigger than her entire apartment back home. There was a bed with too many pillows, a window seat overlooking the orchard, and on the small desk by the window, sitting there like it had been placed deliberately, a single photograph in a plain wooden frame. It was her. Maybe 17 years old in the picture, sitting on the front steps of her old house, laughing at something off camera. She didn't even remember it being taken. "Where did he get this?" she said quietly, mostly to herself. Greta, halfway out the door, paused. "That's not really my story to tell, miss, but I'll say this much, he's been waiting on you a lot longer than 3 days. Then she left, and Mira sat alone in a room too large for her, holding a photograph of a version of herself she barely remembered being, trying to figure out what exactly she'd walked into. The bath, when she finally ran it, turned out to be exactly what she hadn't known she needed. She sat in water hot enough to sting, staring at the steam curling up toward the ceiling, and let herself, for the first time since her father said the number 60,000 out loud, actually feel something. Not relief, not fear, just an exhausted, hollowed-out grief for a life that had been quietly rearranged around her, without her ever getting a real say in it. She thought about the photograph. 17 years old, laughing at something she couldn't remember, completely unaware that somewhere out there a stranger had decided, based on one moment at a summit table when she was 8, that her life was tied to his. It should have terrified her more than it did. After the bath, she found clothes laid out on the bed that she hadn't brought soft, simple things. Nothing extravagant. Nothing that looked chosen to impress anyone. Someone had guessed her size correctly, which unsettled her more than it should have. She got dressed slowly, delaying the moment she'd have to go downstairs and actually face the man whose house this was. When she finally made her way down, following the smell of something cooking, she paused at the bottom of the stairs, hand on the banister, and made herself a promise. Whatever happened at dinner, Whatever he turned out to be, she wasn't going to be the frightened girl from the car anymore. She was going to ask her questions, and she was going to actually listen to the answers, and she was going to decide for herself what kind of situation she'd actually landed in. She took a breath, straightened her shoulders, and walked toward the kitchen. Dinner was set for 2, in a room that felt more like a kitchen than a formal dining hall. A long wooden table, mismatched chairs, a pot of something simmering on the stove that smelled like rosemary and butter. Not what Mira expected from a man who supposedly owned half the Eastern Ridge. She heard him before she saw him. Boots on the porch, low voice saying something to Samuel outside, a laugh that cut off too quickly, like he remembered where he was going and what was waiting for him, and didn't think laughing belonged in it anymore. Then the door opened, and Alpha Corbin walked in. He wasn't what she pictured either. Somehow that had become the theme of the whole day. Nothing was what she pictured. He was tall, yes, broad in the way alphas usually were, but there was nothing performative about it. He didn't fill the doorway like he wanted her to notice. He just walked in, tired, jacket still half wet from the rain outside, and stopped when he saw her sitting at the table. For a second he didn't say anything at all. "You cut your hair," he said finally. Mira blinked. "What? Sorry." He rubbed a hand over his face, looking almost embarrassed, which was the last thing she expected an alpha to look like. "That was forget I said that. Hi, I'm Corbin. I know who you are." "Right, of course you do." He pulled out the chair across from her and sat, slow, like his body was heavier than it should have been. "I meant to be here when you arrived. I'm sorry I wasn't. You don't have to apologize to me. I think I do, actually." He looked at her properly then, and there was something in his face she couldn't name yet, not hunger. Not the thing she'd braced herself for. Something closer to disbelief, like he still wasn't sure she was really sitting there. "You probably have a lot of questions." "I have one," Mira said. "Why me?" Corbin was quiet for a moment. Greta came in with 2 bowls of stew, set them down without a word, and left again, and still he didn't answer right away. "Your father owes money," he said eventually. "That part's true. I'm not going to pretend it isn't. But that's not the real reason." No, he looked down at the bowl in front of him like it had suddenly become very interesting. "It's not." "Then what is?" He exhaled slowly, and when he looked back up at her, something in his expression had shifted steadier now, like he'd decided something. 11 years ago, I was at a summit in the Northern Territory. You were there too. You wouldn't remember. You were maybe 8, hiding under a table because you didn't want to shake hands with a bunch of strangers. Mira frowned. She had no memory of that at all. "I wasn't looking for a mate," Corbin went on. "Wasn't even thinking about it. But I walked past that table, and I still don't fully understand what happened. My wolf just knew. Instantly, like something clicking into place that had been loose my whole life. You're saying I'm your fated mate." "Yes," he said it plainly, no drama in his voice, which somehow made it land harder than if he'd made it sound romantic. "I didn't say anything. You were a kid. I left that summit and I told myself I'd wait. That's all. I'd just wait. For 11 years. For 11 years. He almost smiled, but it didn't quite make it all the way there. "I kept track of you. Not in a way that should scare you. I had people check in occasionally, make sure you were safe. That's all. I never approached. I never would have. If your father hadn't, he stopped himself. If my father hadn't gambled away $60,000 and decided I was worth more to him as payment than as a daughter," Mira finished for him. Corbin's jaw tightened. "I didn't ask him to frame it that way. I offered to clear the debt, quietly, no conditions attached. I want to be very clear about that part, Mira. I told him I'd pay it regardless of what you decided about me. Then why does it feel like a transaction?" "Because he made it one," Corbin said, and there was an edge in his voice now, controlled but real. I told him not to tell you it was a sale. I told him to let me explain it myself. He didn't listen. That's on him, not me. Mira sat with that for a second. She wanted to be angry, had been angry, in the car, in the 4 hours it took to get here, angry at everything, at her father, at the ghost alpha she'd never met, at the whole rotten arrangement. But none of what he'd said matched the shape of the anger she'd built. I don't believe in fate, she said quietly. That's fine, Corbin said. You don't have to. I'm not asking you to believe anything tonight. I'm asking you to eat your stew before it goes cold, and sleep in a bed that's actually yours for as long as you want it, and decide everything else, on your own time. And if I decide I want to leave? Then Samuel drives you home in the morning, Corbin said, without hesitation. The debt's already cleared either way. That part isn't up for negotiation, not even by you. Mira looked at him for a long moment. He held her gaze, didn't flinch from it, didn't do the thing she expected the intense alpha stare designed to make her feel small. He just looked tired and honest, and like a man who'd been waiting so long for something he'd stopped letting himself hope for it. Okay, she said finally. Okay, I'll eat the stew. Something in his shoulders loosened, just slightly, and this time when he almost smiled, it made it all the way there. They ate mostly in silence after that, but it wasn't an uncomfortable one. Every few minutes Corbin would ask something small how the drive was, whether her room was warm enough, whether she liked the stew or was just being polite, and Mira found herself answering honestly, surprised each time at how easy it was. Can I ask you something else? She said, near the end of the meal. Anything. The photograph. In my room. Where did you actually get it? Something flickered across his face, quick and unguarded. I'll tell you eventually. Not tonight, if that's all right. It's not a short story, and I'd rather you get some sleep first. Mira let it go, filing the question away, and finished her stew in the quiet, warm kitchen feeling, for the first time since her father said $60,000 out loud. Something that wasn't quite fear. The days after that dinner settled into something Mira hadn't expected, not tension, not fear. Just a strange, careful quiet, like both of them were circling something neither wanted to name yet. She woke on the 4th morning to sunlight coming through the window seat, and for one disoriented second forgot where she was. Then she remembered, and the memory came with a small, unfamiliar feeling underneath the dread she'd been carrying for days. Something closer to curiosity. She found Greta in the kitchen, already elbow-deep in flour. Sleep all right? Greta asked, not looking up. Better than I expected. That's usually how it goes here. Greta nodded toward a chair. Sit. Eat something. You looked like a ghost when you walked in that first night. Mira sat. Does he always leave this early? Every day since I've known him. Man doesn't know how to rest. Greta slid a plate across the counter eggs, toast, something with rosemary in it that smelled like the stew from the night before. You want to know about him, you're better off asking him than me. But I'll say this, he's not what people think. What do people think? That he's cold, distant, that he hides because he's got something to be ashamed of. Greta snorted. Man's got nothing to be ashamed of. He's just careful. There's a difference, even if most alphas don't understand it. Mira turned that over while she ate. Careful, it fit, somehow, better than anything else she'd have guessed about a man who supposedly bought his own wife. She spent that morning wandering the house properly for the first time, not sneaking, not braced for something bad to happen, just looking. The hallway of photographs she'd passed her first night turned out to be mostly pack history. Old portraits of elders, a faded photo of a much younger Corbin standing beside a stern-faced older man who had to be his father. A handful of pictures from what looked like harvest festivals, pack members laughing around long outdoor tables. Nowhere in any of them did she see herself. Which made sense. She supposed that photograph in her room had clearly been something private, something he hadn't wanted displayed for the whole pack to see and ask questions about. She found the library by accident, pushing open a door she assumed led to a closet. It wasn't large, but it was full floor to ceiling, the kind of collection that took decades to build, not money to buy all at once. She ran her fingers along the spines. History, territory law. A whole shelf of what looked like agricultural texts, notes scrawled in the margins in handwriting she was starting to recognize as Corbin's. On the small reading table near the window sat a single folder, slightly out of place among the neatness of everything else. She knew she shouldn't. She opened it anyway. Inside were newspaper clippings, nothing dramatic, nothing that screamed obsession the way she might have feared. A local paper's coverage of a county fair, 7 years old, with a photo of a crowd where she could just make out her own younger self in the background, laughing with a friend she barely remembered anymore. A school newsletter mentioning a scholarship recipient her name, buried in a list of a dozen others. A single printed page, more recent, listing property records for her father's house, dated maybe 8 months back. She sat with that folder in her lap for a long time. It should have frightened her. Some part of it did, distantly, but mostly what she felt, looking at 11 years of small, quiet fragments collected by a man who'd never once tried to contact her, was something closer to sorrow. This wasn't the file of a predator. This was the file of someone who'd told himself he wasn't allowed to have the thing he wanted, and had settled for scraps instead. She put the folder back exactly as she'd found it, and didn't mention it that night at dinner. But she watched him differently after that, noticed the way he asked about her day like the answer actually mattered to him. The way he never once let his eyes linger too long, like he was still, even now, being careful not to take more than she offered. That evening, after dinner, she found herself lingering at the table instead of retreating upstairs the way she had the previous nights. "Can I ask you something?" she said. "Always, your father." Greta mentioned he was hard. What happened to him? Corbin's expression shifted, something guarded moving behind his eyes. He died when I was 20. Heart, technically, though I've always thought the territory killed him slower than any heart condition could have managed on its own. He inherited a mess from his own father and spent 30 years trying to hold it together through sheer stubbornness instead of strategy. By the time it passed to me, half our allies had quietly drifted toward Renner's camp, and the treasury was in worse shape than anyone let on publicly. That's a lot to inherit at 20. It was. He turned his glass slowly on the table. I didn't sleep more than 4 hours a night for about 3 years straight. Rebuilt the treaties one at a time, mostly by being more patient than anyone expected a 20-year-old alpha to be. People underestimated me for a long time. Turned out to be useful. Is that why you avoid the summits now? Because of everything you had to fix? Something flickered across his face, quick and complicated. That's part of it. Not all of it. I'll tell you the rest eventually. It's tied up with the photograph, actually, more than you'd think. Mira didn't push. She'd learned already that Corbin gave things at his own pace, careful and deliberate, and pushing seemed more likely to close a door than open one. She let the conversation drift toward smaller things instead, the orchard, the town. Greta's baking, and found, without quite meaning to, that she was enjoying herself. It was 2 weeks before Mira met anyone else from the pack. Corbin had kept her mostly at the main house, not out of control, she came to understand, but out of the same instinct that had kept him away from summits for over a decade, a reflexive need to keep anything he cared about out of sight until he was sure it was safe. But by the second week, she'd started asking to see more of the territory, and he'd finally relented, taking her down into the small town that served as the pack's commercial center. It was nothing like she expected. No grand hall, no throne room energy, just a main street with a hardware store. A bakery that smelled like cinnamon from half a block away. A handful of kids chasing each other around a fountain in the town square. People nodded at Corbin as they passed. A few stopped to talk, mostly about mundane things, a fence that needed repair, someone's roof, a dispute over water rights 2 farms over that Corbin promised to look into personally. "They're not afraid of you," Mira said, once they were walking again. "Should they be? I don't know. Everyone talks about you like you're this untouchable, unknowable figure. This isn't that." Corbin was quiet for a moment. "The alpha thing, the politics, the border disputes, that's a small part of what I actually do. Most days I'm just trying to make sure this town doesn't fall apart the way it almost did under my father. People don't need to fear someone for that. They just need to trust him." At the bakery, the woman behind the counter, older, sharp-eyed, clearly someone who'd known Corbin a long time, looked between the two of them with an expression Mira couldn't quite place. "Well," the woman said finally. "About time." "Ruth," Corbin said, something like warning in his voice, though it didn't have any real heat behind it. "I'm just saying, man's been walking around here for a decade looking like someone died. Now look at him." Ruth handed Mira a small paper bag without being asked, something warm and cinnamon-smelling inside. "On the house, dear. Anyone who puts that look on his face gets free pastries for life, as far as I'm concerned." Mira laughed, actually laughed, the first real laugh since she'd arrived, and caught Corbin watching her with an expression so unguarded it made her chest ache a little. "What?" she said. "Nothing." He shook his head, small smile pulling at the corner of his mouth. "I just don't think I've heard you laugh before." "Well, don't get used to it." "Too late," he said, and the way he said it, quiet and certain, stayed with her the whole walk back. They stopped at the fountain on the way, Corbin buying roasted nuts from a cart she hadn't noticed on the way in, and sat on the edge of the stone basin, while a handful of kids ran circles around them, shrieking with the particular joy of children who had nowhere important to be. "Do you want kids someday?" Mira asked, before she could stop herself, and then immediately regretted it. "Sorry, you don't have to answer that." "I don't mind the question." Corbin watched the kids for a moment before answering. "I used to think I didn't. Spent so many years focused on holding this territory together that the idea of a family felt like something that happened to other people. Easier that way, honestly, harder to lose things you never let yourself want. And now I'm sitting on a fountain with roasted nuts, watching you laugh for the first time, and finding that particular old certainty a lot less certain than it used to be." He said it lightly, almost teasing, but there was something underneath it that wasn't teasing at all. Mira didn't know what to say to that, so she didn't say anything, just watched the kids chase each other around the fountain and let the warmth of the afternoon settle over her, strange and unfamiliar, and she was starting to admit to herself, not unwelcome. On the walk back to the car, an older man stopped Corbin to ask about a property line dispute, and Mira found herself standing slightly apart, watching him work patient, thorough, asking questions instead of dictating answers, treating an argument over a few feet of fence line with the same seriousness he probably gave to actual treaties. It was a small thing, but it told her more about who he actually was than anything he'd said at dinner. By the time they got back to the estate, the afternoon light was turning gold over the orchard, and Mira realized, with something like surprise, that she hadn't thought about her father once the entire day. The first real crack in the peace came 3 weeks in, and it didn't come from Renner. It came from inside the pack itself. Mira was in the garden with Greta when she heard raised voices from the front of the house, not shouting exactly, but tense, clipped, the kind of conversation that had teeth in it even without volume. She recognized Corbin's voice, and beneath it, another man's, older, rougher. "Who's that?" she asked. Greta's face had gone carefully neutral. "That'll be Dale." He was Corbin's father's second, way back. Doesn't much care for how things have changed. Mira moved closer to the hedge separating the garden from the front drive, close enough to hear without being seen. Can't keep hiding her here like she's some kind of secret, Dale was saying. Pack's talking. Corbin, they see a strange girl living in your house for a month. No announcement, no ceremony, and they start telling themselves stories. Some of those stories aren't kind to you. Let them talk. That's easy for you to say. You're not the one who has to manage the whispering every time I'm in town. Half the elders think you've lost your mind. The other half think you're keeping some human mistress up here while you wait for a proper mate. Something in Mira's chest went cold and tight at that. She hadn't let herself consider what the pack actually thought of her, beyond the abstract threat of Renner using her as leverage. She is my mate, Corbin said, low and final. Fated, not proper, not improper. Mine, that's the last time I'll explain that to anyone, Dale, including you. Then, mark her, publicly, end the whispering before Renner turns it into a weapon, because you know he will. When she's ready. Not before. And if she's never ready, you'll let this whole territory keep guessing while Renner builds a case against you out of nothing but rumor? There was a long silence. Mira didn't hear Corbin's answer, if he gave one at all, but she heard Dale's boots on the gravel a moment later, walking away, and then nothing. She waited a few minutes before going inside, composing her face into something neutral, though her mind was still turning over what she'd heard. She found Corbin in the front hall, jaw tight, staring at nothing in particular. I heard, she said. He turned, something flickering across his face, embarrassment, maybe, or guilt. You weren't supposed to. Is it true, what Dale said, about the pack talking? Some of it. Corbin exhaled, rubbing the back of his neck. Dale's not wrong that people are curious, concerned even. I haven't exactly given them much to work with, keeping you mostly to the house these first weeks. Why did you? Because I wanted you to have time, he said simply. Not pressure, not a pack full of people evaluating you before you'd even decided if you wanted to stay. I know that's created its own problems. I didn't think it through as well as I should have. Mira studied him for a moment. You're allowed to want things without apologizing for them, you know. Old habit, he said. Hard to shake. She reached out, surprising herself, and took his hand. Tell me what marking actually means. Not the political version, the real one. Corbin's fingers tightened around hers, gentle but certain. It means the bond becomes permanent. Physical, not just felt. It means anyone who looks at you will know exactly what you are to me, and there's no undoing that, not easily, not without real damage to both of us. He paused. It also means I stop being able to protect you by keeping you invisible. You'd be a target the way I am. Fully. But it also means Renner can't use rumors against you anymore. Yes, then maybe, Mira said slowly, testing the words as she said them. It's not about being ready. Maybe it's about deciding. Corbin looked at her for a long moment, something raw moving behind his eyes. Don't decide this because of Dale, or Renner, or anyone circling this house with an agenda. Please, I need this to be yours. It is mine, she said. I'm just telling you I'm not scared of it the way you think I am. That night, unable to sleep, Mira found herself back in the library, sitting in the same chair where she'd first opened Corbin's folder of clippings. She didn't open it again. She just sat with the weight of the last few weeks, the debt, the drive, the photograph, Dale's voice through the hedge, the folder full of quiet fragments of a life she'd barely known she was being watched over. She thought about her old life, the version of herself who'd sat frozen in the car 4 hours, convinced she was walking into a trap. That version felt distant now, almost like someone else entirely. She wasn't sure when exactly the shift had happened, somewhere between the apple orchard and Ruth's free pastries and the folder of clippings. somewhere in the accumulation of small, careful kindnesses that didn't match anything she'd braced herself for. She didn't know yet if what she felt for Corbin was love. Not really. Not the kind people wrote songs about. But she knew it wasn't fear anymore, and for the first time since her father said $60,000 out loud, that felt like enough of an answer to build on. Renner's next move came a week later, and it wasn't subtle. It started with a fire not at the main house, but at the edge of the territory. A barn belonging to one of the pack's oldest families burned to the ground overnight. No one hurt, thankfully, but the message was unmistakable. This was Ashcroft land, and Ashcroft land was no longer safe. Corbin left before dawn, taking a dozen guards with him, and didn't come back until well past dark. Mira sat up waiting, and when he finally walked through the door, mud-streaked and exhausted, something in his face told her the barn wasn't the worst of it. "There's a note," he said, dropping heavily into a chair at the kitchen table. Greta had left food out for him, but he didn't touch it. Left at the site. No signature, but the handwriting matches correspondence I've had from Renner's camp before. What did it say? Corbin hesitated, and Mira recognized the hesitation for what it was, him trying to decide how much to shield her from. "Don't," she said. "Don't do that thing where you protect me from the truth. Tell me." He met her eyes, and something in his posture shifted, like he was recalibrating, remembering the conversation from the week before. Her hand in his. Her insistence that she wasn't as fragile as he kept treating her. It said Ashcroft's next fire won't be a barn. It said Renner's patient, but not infinitely. The room went very quiet. "He's threatening the house," Mira said. "Threatening me. I won't let that happen. I know you won't try. I'm asking what we actually do about it." Corbin ran both hands through his hair, and for a moment he looked less like an alpha holding a territory together, and more like a man staring down the edge of something he couldn't fully control. "I called an emergency council with the elders tonight, before I came back. Told them everything, the fire, the note, all of it. Dale was right, weeks ago. The whispering isn't just gossip anymore. It's giving Renner room to operate, because as long as there's ambiguity about who you are to me, he can frame any move against this house as a border dispute instead of what it actually is. An attack on a mated pair. So the mark isn't just about the pack's comfort anymore." "No," Corbin admitted. "It's about making it politically and biologically impossible for Renner to pretend this is anything other than what it is. A war he'd be starting against a bonded alpha pair, not a lonely man hiding a secret." Mira sat with that for a long moment, watching the exhaustion etched into every line of his face. "Then let's stop giving him room." "Mira, I already told you," she said, steady. "This isn't me deciding out of fear. I've had 3 weeks to watch you be careful with me in every possible way a person can be careful. I trust you. I want this. Renner just happens to be the reason it's happening now instead of next month." Corbin reached across the table and took her hand, holding it like something precious and slightly unbelievable. "If we do this, it has to be public. In front of the full council, the elders, everyone. That's the only way it actually closes the door Renner's trying to walk through. Then let's do it in front of everyone." The days that followed moved with a strange, charged urgency. Corbin doubled the guard rotation around the estate and the town's perimeter, and Mira noticed the shift immediately. More watchful eyes, longer silences, a tension running under every conversation that hadn't been there before. Dale came by twice more that week, and this time when Mira overheard him, his tone had changed entirely. Less accusation, more grim practicality, like a man bracing for a fight he'd been warning everyone about for months, and was almost relieved to finally see coming. "You're doing the right thing," she heard him tell Corbin, on the second visit. "Wish it hadn't taken a fire to get you there. But you're doing right by her, and by the pack. That's more than I expected, if I'm honest." Would have gotten there eventually, Dale. Maybe. Doesn't matter now. What matters is making sure the ceremony's ironclad. I want every elder in that hall, every witness Renner can't dispute later. If he wants a fight, let's make sure he's picking it against something he can't touch. Mira found something oddly comforting in Dale's gruffness, now that it was pointed at protecting rather than criticizing. It told her something about the pack she was marrying into, that even the ones who doubted her were willing to close ranks the moment an actual threat appeared. It wasn't loyalty to her yet. Not really. But it was loyalty to Corbin, and by extension, loyalty to whatever he'd decided mattered. That night, lying awake in the room that had slowly, over 3 weeks, started to feel less like a stranger's guest room and more like hers, Mira found herself thinking not about fear, but about the ceremony ahead, about what it would mean to stand in front of 200 strangers and claim, out loud, a life she hadn't chosen but had somehow, slowly, come to want. The ceremony was set for 3 days later, and in that time, Mira learned more about pack tradition than she had in her entire life up to that point. Greta walked her through the basics, the significance of the mark itself, the small rituals that surrounded a formal claiming, the difference between a private mark and one done in front of a full council, which apparently carried legal weight in pack law that a private mark did not. It's not just romance, Greta explained, helping Mira into a deep green dress the morning of the ceremony, not white, not the human wedding tradition Mira had half expected, but something that apparently held its own significance in wolf custom. A public mark, in front of the elders, makes you pack, not just his, yours too, in your own right. You'll have standing here that can't be taken away, no matter what happens between you and Corbin down the line. I don't plan on anything happening between us down the line. Greta smiled, adjusting a pin in Mira's hair. No one ever does, dear, but it's good to know the ground's solid under your feet regardless. Mira sat still while Greta worked, watching herself slowly transform in the mirror hair, pinned back the way the old customs apparently required, the green dress settling around her like something borrowed from a version of her life she hadn't known was coming. She thought about her father, briefly, wondered if he'd ever find out this happened, wondered if it would matter to him either way. Nervous, Greta asked, catching her expression in the mirror. A little, that's normal. I'd worry more if you weren't. Greta finished the last pin and stepped back, studying her work. For what it's worth, dear, I've seen a lot of claimings in my time here, political ones, arranged ones, a few real ones. This is a real one. You can always tell. How? The real ones are the ones where the alpha looks more nervous than the girl. Mira laughed despite herself, and Greta's smile widened, satisfied. The great hall. When Mira finally saw it fully occupied for the first time, was nothing like she'd imagined weeks ago on the drive up no cold stone intimidation, but something warmer, wood-beamed and candlelit, packed with more people than she'd realized the territory even held. Dale stood near the front, arms crossed, expression unreadable. Ruth from the bakery was there too, beaming, which helped steady Mira's nerves more than she expected. Corbin waited at the center of the room, and when she walked in, something in his face broke open completely, all the careful restraint of the last 3 weeks gone, replaced by something so plainly, nakedly relieved that a few of the elders actually murmured at the sight of it. Alpha Corbin, the eldest of the council, said, stepping forward, an older woman with sharp eyes and a voice that carried effortlessly through the hall. You've called this council to formalize a claiming. Is this correct? It is. And you. The woman turned to Mira, gaze softening slightly. Do you come to this claiming freely, of your own will, without coercion? Mira thought about the drive up, the $60,000, the version of herself who'd sat frozen in that car 4 hours convinced she was walking into a trap. Then she thought about the folder of newspaper clippings, the apple orchard, 11 years of careful, silent waiting. I do, she said, and found she meant it completely. The ceremony itself was simpler than she expected, words exchanged, old and formal, some of which she didn't fully understand but felt the weight of anyway. There was a moment where the eldest elder placed both their hands together and spoke something in a language Mira didn't recognize. Old enough that even some of the younger pack members in the hall seemed to be hearing it for the first time. She felt the weight of 200 witnesses pressing in around her, not unkindly, just present, marking this moment as something that belonged to the whole territory now, not just the two of them. And then Corbin's hand found her jaw, tilting her head gently, giving her one last look that asked permission even now, even here, in front of the entire pack. She nodded. His teeth found the curve of her neck, and this time, unlike the private version she'd imagined weeks ago, the whole hall seemed to hold its breath with her. The bond snapped into place with a warmth that spread through her entire body, gold and steady. And she heard. Distantly, the hall erupt into sound cheering, someone crying, Ruth's voice louder than anyone's. When she opened her eyes, Corbin was looking at her like she was the only thing in the room. "Mine," he said quietly, just for her. "Yours," she agreed. Officially, apparently, in front of about 200 witnesses. He laughed a real laugh, unguarded, the kind she was starting to realize he didn't let many people see. "I did warn you it would be public." The rest of the evening dissolved into something Mira hadn't expected, not solemn ceremony anymore, but genuine celebration, long tables set up outside under strings of lantern light, food she couldn't begin to name all of. Pack members she'd never met coming up one after another to introduce themselves, welcome her, tell her small stories about Corbin from years she hadn't known him. She learned he'd once spent an entire winter personally repairing fences for families who couldn't afford the labor. She learned he'd quietly paid for a dozen kids' schooling over the years, never taking credit, never letting anyone thank him publicly. "He'd hate that I told you that," an older woman confided, refilling Mira's glass. "Doesn't like people knowing the soft parts of him." "Guess you'll be finding all of that out yourself now, though." Mira watched him across the courtyard, deep in conversation with Dale, both of them looking more relaxed than she'd seen either of them in weeks, and felt something settle in her chest that she hadn't expected to feel this soon, not certainty, exactly, but something close to it. A sense that whatever came next, she wasn't facing it as a stranger dropped into someone else's life anymore. She was Pack now, hers as much as his. Later, after most of the guests had gone and the lanterns had burned low, Corbin found her sitting alone at the edge of the courtyard, looking out at the dark line of the orchard. "Tired?" he asked, settling beside her. A good kind of tired. She leaned into him slightly, testing the new weight of the bond, the steady warmth of it settling under her collarbone. "Is it always like that?" The bond feeling. This warm. For a fated pair, usually, yes, he wrapped an arm around her, careful, like he was still checking whether it was welcome. It settles, over time. Becomes less overwhelming, more like background warmth instead of a live current. But it doesn't go away. "Good," Mira said, surprising herself with how much she meant it. "I don't think I'd want it to." Renner's response, when it came, was almost anticlimactic after everything that had led up to it. Word of the public mark spread through the territories within days, the way word always did among packs faster and more thoroughly than any official announcement could have managed. Within a week, Corbin received a formal message from Renner's camp, a curt acknowledgement of the mating, an assurance that the border misunderstanding would be resolved through proper channels, no further mention of fires or threats. "That's it?" Mira asked, reading over Corbin's shoulder as he reviewed the letter at the kitchen table. After everything, he just backs down because of a piece of paper and a public ceremony? He backs down because attacking a bonded pair, publicly, with witnesses from a dozen packs at the ceremony, isn't a border dispute anymore. It's an act of war against a legitimate mated alpha. Renner's ambitious, not suicidal. He'll find another angle eventually, but this one's closed. Eventually, there's always an eventually, with men like Renner. Corbin folded the letter and set it aside, reaching for her hand instead. But it's not today's problem. Today's problem is that Greta's been asking for 3 days when we're finally going to eat a meal at a normal hour instead of working through dinner. Mira laughed and let him pull her up from the chair, out onto the porch where the last of the afternoon light was falling gold over the orchard. Dale stopped by later that week, ostensibly to discuss the barn rebuild, but Mira suspected it was as much to see how she'd settled since the ceremony. He found her in the garden, and for a long moment just studied her, arms crossed in his usual gruff way. "You did all right up there," he said finally. "In the hall. Didn't flinch once, far as I could tell. I was terrified. Didn't look it. That matters, for what it's worth. Pack notices things like that. Whether their alpha's mate can hold steady when it counts." He shifted, looking almost uncomfortable. "For what it's worth, I was wrong about you. Figured you'd bolt the first chance you got, given how it all started. Glad to be wrong. That's about as close to an apology as I'm going to get, isn't it?" Dale allowed himself something close to a smile, close as you'll get. Yeah, her father sent one letter, months later, care of Greta, who'd apparently given him the address without asking Mira first. Mira held it for a long time before opening it, not sure, even then, what she wanted it to say. It wasn't an apology, not really. It was closer to an explanation, the kind that tried to make itself sound like an apology without actually admitting fault. He was sorry for how it happened, he wrote. Not sorry that it happened, exactly. Sorry for the manner of it. Mira read it twice, then folded it and set it in the same drawer where she kept the photograph from her old bedroom, the one Corbin had commissioned all those years ago. She didn't write back. Some doors, she'd decided somewhere in the last few months, didn't need closing with words. They just needed to stay shut. Life at the estate settled into something steady after that, not without its complications, not without the ordinary friction of two people learning each other properly for the first time, but steady in a way Mira hadn't expected to find anywhere, let alone here. She learned Corbin's habits, the way he got quiet and withdrawn after long council meetings, the way he softened almost immediately the moment he walked back into the house and found her there. She learned to read the pack's rhythms too, the town's small dramas, Ruth's endless gossip, Dale's gruff but genuine loyalty, Greta's quiet steadiness underneath it all. A year after the ceremony, on the anniversary of the day she'd first walked up that gravel drive expecting gargoyles and cold stone, and found apple trees instead, Corbin finally told her the rest of the story behind the photograph. They were on the porch again, the same spot where he'd explained, months ago. Why he'd stayed away from summits for over a decade. The orchard was in full bloom this time, not the tired late-season fruit she'd first seen, and the evening air smelled like it always did up here, rain that hadn't fallen yet, rosemary from Greta's garden. Something warm underneath it all that Mira had started, somewhere along the way to think of as home. "I paid a photographer," Corbin said, turning his mug slowly in his hands. "Once, just once, when you were 17. I told myself it was for security purposes, a way to make sure my people watching over you from a distance actually knew what you looked like as you got older. That was a lie I told myself so I wouldn't have to admit the truth." Which was? I wanted something to hold on to. He looked at her, something soft and unguarded in his expression, the same look Ruth had commented on that first day in the bakery. 11 years is a long time to wait for someone you're not allowed to approach. I told myself I was being careful, being responsible, protecting you from every threat I could imagine. All of that was true, but underneath it, some nights, I just wanted proof you existed. That the girl under the table at that summit had actually grown up somewhere, was actually laughing at something, even if I wasn't the one who got to hear it. Mira set her own mug down and reached for his hand. That's the loneliest thing you've ever told me. It was a lonely 11 years, Corbin admitted, but I'd live every one of them again, exactly the same way, if it still ended here. Even the part where my father sold me to pay off a debt? Even that part, he said, though I'd have preferred a version where he told you the truth from the start, instead of making it sound like a transaction. You deserved better than that entrance into this, maybe, Mira said, leaning into him, feeling the steady warmth of the bond settle through her chest the way it always did now, familiar as breathing. But I like where it ended up too much to complain about how it started. They sat like that for a long while, the orchard turning slowly from gold to gray as the sun dropped behind the tree line. The sound of Greta moving around inside drifting faintly through the open kitchen window, the whole territory settling into the particular quiet of an evening that had nothing urgent left to demand of it. "Do you ever think about it?" Mira asked eventually. "What would have happened if my father hadn't gambled everything away? If there'd never been a debt to pay?" Corbin considered the question seriously, the way he considered most things. "I've wondered whether I'd have found some other way to finally approach you, once you were old enough, once I'd convinced myself the danger had passed. I'd like to think I would have. But I honestly don't know. I'd gotten very good at telling myself to wait a little longer. Might have kept telling myself that for years past when I should have stopped. So in a strange way, my father actually did me a favor. Don't let him know that," Corbin said, dry, and Mira laughed, the sound carrying out over the darkening orchard. "I like where it ended up too much to complain about how it started," she said again, softer this time, more to herself than to him. "But I am glad it ended up somewhere I got to choose, that the choosing mattered to you as much as it did." "It was always going to matter," Corbin said. "You could have said no in that kitchen, that first dinner. Could have said no on the ceremony morning, up until the second you nodded. I meant that. Every step. Still do." Corbin pressed a kiss to the top of her head and out past the porch. The orchard held its quiet, and somewhere further off, past the edge of Ashcroft land, the border with Renner's territory sat still and settled. A war that never got to happen. Because a man who'd waited 11 years finally stopped being careful long enough to ask for what he wanted. And a woman who'd arrived expecting nothing but a transaction had found, instead, a life worth choosing on her own terms.